everybody, welcome into the MTOM studio number 2. We're going to have a conversation for you on the MTOM Show podcast today. I'm Paul Yeager. Glad to have you here. If you have any feedback for me, send me an email at paul.yeager@iowapbs.org. That's YEAGER @iowapbs.org. Today, we're going to get a little political without quite talking politics. Does that make sense? We're going to talk politics and policy and where the two interact and what's at stake at the election that's coming up here in just a few days, as we have every seat in Congress up for grabs, as well as a whole bunch of the Senate, some governors, and some other issues and how they relate to agriculture across the ballots in the United States this year. Our guest today is Jonathan Coppess. He's at the University of Illinois, where he teaches ag policy. He has a background in policy. He's worked on the Farm Bill from a senator in Nebraska. He was on his staff, Senator Nelson. We're also going to kind of look at how who wins will determine a whole lot about the way the next Farm Bill is shaped. Will it be one that has more spending for supplemental nutrition, for conservation, for some of those practices that we could see? We'll lay that out, play that out, and have that discussion with Jonathan. We're also going to just kind of go over some good old ranges, and as always, I have to talk sports. We start first with football. Jonathan, I'd be remiss if I didn't start with sports. Brett Bielema's impact on the University of Illinois football team is what?
Well, he's doing a great job this season. I think we're ranked 17th now, so that's been nice to see. Had some tough years here, at least since I've been here.
The Tiger Hawk tattoo, not a distraction?
I haven't noticed it. I haven't looked too closely.
He made reference to it. He has to make reference to it. All those former Hawkeye coaches do. But it is fun. But there is a lot of fun when it comes to athletics between states. Iowa, Illinois just doesn't quite have the same cachet as Farmageddon does in Illinois, or between Kansas State and Iowa State, right?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think a lot depends on where you sit and when you're sitting there. I do know my wife's family is from Western Illinois, and so their view of Iowa, Illinois is quite intense.
Oh yeah, as it should be, right? It's supposed to be intense. Yeah. Are you Illinois native?
I'm not. I grew up in Ohio, so a different kind of football intensity. Yeah, different kind of football intensity over there.
Farm background?
I did. My family farms in Western Ohio. Actually, Dad retired, so we're transitioning now, I guess.
Do you have someone left there in the family, or did it transition to someone outside?
Well, we're renting it out these days. Yeah.
How did you go from being life on the farm? I know how my story goes. People of this podcast have heard it a time or two. How did it go that you didn't stay?
Yeah, I always like to joke that I was pushed off the farm because I couldn't plant straight. That and I argued with everybody, so I ended up going to law school. So imagine that. So between my incompetence on the tractor and my arguing with Grandpa and Dad, I think we all knew there's a different path.
You were encouraged to seek other fields, not ours. I say I was too good at planting tractors. I always got stuck. Yeah. I'd always find those wet spots. So
I'd start to nod off, in those rows. And then I always liked it when Grandpa grabbed me during harvest. He's like, come here and ride with me for a little bit. I want to show you something.
So ag was ag the destination for law school, or were you thinking, I'm going to be this hotshot defense attorney or prosecutor?
Well, I don't know if I've ever thought about being a hotshot. I did, as a kid, want to go to Chicago. And so I kind of had out on the horizon. I wanted to practice law in Chicago at some point. I came back around to ag, actually, when I went to D.C. And wanted to work on federal policy. And so it sort of, roundabout way, got back into it.
So that wasn't the intent at the beginning. It was a roundabout way.
Yeah, it was not the intent at the beginning. I was in Chicago for about 4 years practicing big firm litigation, corporate litigation work, and kind of hit a point where I was like, this isn't what I want to do. So I had to go in search of of what I wanted to do. And I joke about that too. You know that being a litigator was too honest and reputable of an occupation. So I went into politics and policy just to make sure I'd scaled the lowest I could.
What about policy was of interest to you?
I always, if I were to look back on all the, all the ways I went wrong, besides not planting straight, I've always been just fascinated with history and government and politics. I mean, this also I blame on my grandfather, who was a county commissioner for a while and was like, the politician in the family. And so I still have great memories of talking politics with Grandpa, or being dragged into. He'd be in a meeting with somebody, and there were no conversations that didn't eventually get to politics. So I just kind of had always this interest, and when I was in Chicago, sort of came back to me that I really think I want to be in that arena for a while and see it, and so I did. I went out to D.C. and then. Got lucky. I landed with Senator Ben Nelson from Nebraska, and got to work on the 2008 Farm Bill with him. And so, kind of things worked out from there.
Well, there's the movies, and I've known people that have gone to law school. There's idealistic views when you're in law school about how you're going to change the world. When you went to Washington, D.C., did you feel that you were going to change agriculture working on that Farm Bill?
I don't know. I don't know what I thought. I knew I wanted to work on it. I don't know about changing things. I think I think I was more just wanting to learn, and wanting to see it, more than maybe kind of thinking about. I didn't come into it with like, well, there's the policy I think we should have, or any of that. I was really, kind of true to form. I'm at a university now because I'm a geek. Like I wanted to, and I remember just sort of being the sponge. Like you'd walk around the Capitol hallways and just kind of be, looking around and thinking, oh my gosh, Lyndon Johnson's office was right there, and those sort of historical aspects. So that's really kind of where I came at it from, was wanting to learn and wanting to experience it. And then as you go through it, you obviously start to really think about, okay, what about this makes sense or doesn't make sense, and you get in a lot of these discussions, and that's where I think ideas about changing policy or what might be not just ideal but feasible, possible, and doable.
We are facing an election here in a few days. What has greater impact on policy? Those staffers like you were, or those who you work for?
It is. Elections have such a huge impact on all policy, and I think there's no understating the importance of it. I still, again, as sort of a geek of this, I still struggle with some of our low turnout rates and the fact that more people should participate. So elections have significant consequences for policy. I think most staffers. And it was an amazing job to be on staff and to be running around. So the boss kind of sets the senator or the chair or the representative. They kind of set the direction, and those are sort of bigger picture kind of perspectives. And then a lot of the staff is working around that and trying to move in that direction that that the boss may have pointed in, or that that the constituency is really pushing for or in need of. And so it is a combination. It really is a member by member driven component. I do think that many of these members try really hard to represent their constituents or their understanding of where their constituents have needs. But the pressures that come into these discussions are massive, and they are intense.
Well, and every 2 years, staffs can change and work can be undone, but a staffer can go from one office to another, and they might get hired by somebody who wins an election in Illinois or Iowa, that might get a seat at that table that helps dictate it, and that representative or senator or whoever might not have that same knowledge that the staffer does. How important is that relationship to say, you're not saying, hey, I know more than you, but you are.
You would never say that. It's
Not
it's
if you wanted to keep
detail.
a job. Yeah.
That's right. Those jobs can be lost very quickly. It's a detail issue, and as a staffer, your job is to really get lost in the weeds and the details of these things, and then translate that up and make sure the boss understands. The senator, the member understands, like, and then they've got to have a level of confidence in you and trust that you will absorb the details and you will get lost in the weeds, and then it will translate and that you work through that. And it was quite the learning process to do it. There were many days when I was surprised I still had a job at the end of the day or the next morning. But it's also, it makes it so much fun. It's such a great challenge and such an incredible. I found DC and Capitol Hill to be just this unbelievable work environment of, very motivated individuals. I felt old most of the time, even older now, but very motivated, very, very dedicated to what they're trying to do, and but also know how to have fun with it and know how to joke around and sort of work through difficult and sometimes intense issues and be able to laugh about it at the end of the day or early in the morning whenever some of those negotiations would end.
We are again facing an election here in a couple of days. At stake is the next farm bill for rural America. Is that pretty accurate?
Well, the next Congress is scheduled to rewrite it. The last farm bill was in 2018, and it's scheduled. Some of it is scheduled to expire in 2023. There's been some changes, like the Inflation Reduction Act, for example, has extended conservation policy for a much longer window. So that is the expectation. But I think, to your point, a lot about what Congress will do or can do will be determined by this election. I think we have very stark differences in governing philosophy or ideology and direction, and those things will have a huge impact on it.
Are there areas that matter more geographically, where members come from and carrying weight in these discussions?
Well, Farm Bill, at least in my experience and from what I've researched in history, Farm Bills are really regional. We have kind of this three-part sort of farm coalition where we have the Midwestern corn interests, we have wheat interests in the Western plains in particular, and then the Southern commodities, cotton and rice and peanuts. And so a lot of farm policy is sort of dictated by how those three interact or work together or don't work together, or kind of the conflicts and negotiations around that. And then you think a lot about how that coalition or that group of interests then kind of are driving forces in getting a farm bill, particularly through committees. And then your bigger coalition really involves the food assistance program and the supplemental nutrition assistance program, which has become, well, it's always been very political. It's become much more partisan in recent years, and has been a huge challenge for writing a farm bill whenever there's this sort of partisan attack on it. So you've got the farm interest, you've got the low-income food assistance, and then you have conservation, which really is kind of a connective tissue between a lot of farm country and a lot of non-farm country, because the impacts on natural resources like water, like habitat, and those sorts of things really come through the conservation title. So your average consumer may not know much about the farm risk management programs like crop insurance, but they may understand even better that, here we are trying to preserve soil or keep waterways clean and free of nutrients and runoff and things like that. So it's one of the things that's made a farm bill very, very successful over. And if they do reauthorize next year, it'll be 90 years since the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933. So it's been a 9-decade run. That's pretty impressive for any legislation, particularly when you think about how many times Congress has debated it and fought over it. But really, the success is sort of attributed to this ability to build this coalition and then maintain it through some pretty tough politics. But that also lends itself to the very next question you probably have, which is how will this look?
Well, we'll get to that, how it looks in a minute. Is it good to have this thing reauthorized every 5 years?
Well, I mean, I'm not a I'm not an unbiased observer. I think it is. I actually think um, I think there's value in this sort of reconsideration and deliberating through some of the policies to the extent that we do, and it doesn't get caught up in some of the other issues. But if we think about the changes in agriculture and how make sure the policy can keep up with it, we think about some of the issues coming up that you would want to reconsider around climate change and conservation and natural resource issues, for example. That may not have been the same conversation 50 years ago. So I do think there's value in it. I do think it forces that evaluation and reevaluation. But it also creates no small amount of challenges. It is a difficult thing to move through the legislative process, even with a pretty powerful coalition like we see around the Farm Bill. And there can be these tendencies to kind of get stuck in a mindset that it's better to protect what I have than to think about innovating or moving things along. And so we see those challenges as well. But the opportunity to do so is significant. I think it's important.
We just finished the World Food Prize here in Des Moines. And more than 10 years ago, I had a chance to talk to Senators Dole and McGovern and ask them about their efforts and how the challenges were then, when it truly was a coalition of rural and urban because of the food and the farm aspects. That to me is still lost on many people, that you have to have the urban coalition as much as the rural to push this thing along. Does someone have more of an upside in these negotiations? Because when it's, say, roughly 75-25 more food than food and fiber?
Well, I think that's a really good question and not an easy one to answer. I think it much depends on the state of play in Congress on this. I think with the food assistance program in particular, with SNAP, it is an incredible. It's just an incredible set of policies to help Americans eat, and so even if we don't think of it as a farm support system, it is an indirect support to agriculture and farming because of the production of food and helping those who might otherwise struggle to put food on the table be able to do so. So I think it's important. To your point, it connects with rural communities where there are challenges with poverty, but it also connects locally. I mean, there are many, many SNAP recipients in rural America. In fact, I think what we are seeing across the country with what has just been multiple decades of hollowing out small towns and jobs being shipped overseas or lost to communities that are not replaced, that the poverty we're seeing in many parts of rural America is both tough, but is also a reminder that these things connect not just with a city like Chicago, but with some small towns around where those big open square fields are that are growing corn and soybeans. And so I think it's important across the board. As far as who kind of has the advantage, again, I think a lot depends on the leadership in the Senate and the House of Representatives and the leadership at the committee levels. And I think we've seen that, frankly, pretty painfully the last two farm bills in 2014 and 2018, where leadership in the House of Representatives in particular made a focus on, well, 75% of the funds go to SNAP, so we've got to start cutting things there. And that, really, I think, misunderstands a really key part, which is more than 40 million. It may be 75% of the spending, and it may be $100 billion a year, but we're talking upwards of 40 million Americans and families who are getting relatively small amounts of assistance to put food on the table. And I think it's one of the challenges we have in our political system these days, where we've gotten so wrapped up in budgets and comparing these bottom line issues, and we kind of miss that there are people on the other end of these policies, and that there are differences in a policy that serves 40 million versus a policy may serve only a few 100,000.
You're a policy guy, maybe not necessarily an election guy. However, let's put the two together. Is there a certain, I guess I don't, a certain party in charge is one question, but a certain type of leader that could emerge in either one of these scenarios, if it is a red wave or if blue stays in power, on how maybe some of the questions that you just mentioned are answered?
Yes, I think what we've seen, again, using the two most recent farm bill cycles as our kind of our example, what we can work from as the most recent history. In those cases, the House of Representatives in particular focused very much on budget cutting by Republican leadership. And when that is the case, obviously the biggest budget item is SNAP. And so we sort of, you can almost see it happen. If we redirect to the budget, how do we cut spending? How do we, deal with deficits and so forth? Then you just see it progress into, well, then we've got to go after SNAP. And once you do that, it really complicates or nearly tears apart that coalition. And then the votes that you need to get through, as I like to say, that once you go down, once everything's a budget issue, kind of the old, if all I have is a hammer, everything's a nail. It doesn't end with SNAP. I mean, they're going to look at farm subsidies. They're going to look at crop insurance and conservation. It becomes this sort of, we've got to cut. And so it is a counterproductive policy discussion. It becomes very partisan, and it becomes, very hard to hold together a coalition that is needed to get the votes in Congress. That's especially true in the House of Representatives. The Senate has traditionally been much less, focused on the hard partisan sort of budget cutting exercise, but that doesn't mean it wouldn't come into play if in certain circumstances. And they still have to negotiate it out with the House. You still have to find a way through the House. So I think that's a big part of it. We watch for the budget, the real sort of budget focus, knowing how that's worked on the coalition in the past. And then this regional issue around farm policy. Is this, do we see a sort of a Southern push from a chair, or a Western push if it's a wheat issues, or Midwestern and so forth? And so you can kind of, map out some of your politics based on those two sort of big guideposts, if you will. But so much depends on the makeup of the committee, and who not just who's holding the gavel, but who's the ranking member, and how do the members up and down the line look at the bill, look at the vote counting out on the chamber floor, and look at the politics back home. So I don't want to make it sound like there's an easy kind of like, well, this will definitely happen. Yeah. But we have seen some pretty clear examples of what can go wrong in the last two farm bills.
Those involved in agriculture think it's pretty important. But does that issue resonate with the regular voter in all of these congressional and Senate districts, that this is something that I don't see an ad for Congress or Senate on my TV that highlights so-and-so will cut everything in the farm bill or will bloat it. I don't see it. Do you?
It is sort of, thinking through history. I think the last time we can kind of pinpoint where a farm bill policy may have had an impact on an election was probably 1954, at least from the arguments from a lot of the players at the time. So you're not likely to see any, political ads really focus in on this. And I mean, that's just the nature of a 30-second ad, and the sort of brutal skim across the top of things that politics and campaigning kind of requires. But I think it's this sort of governing philosophy that matters. Are we thinking about policies and programs in the sense of, we talk about inflation, for example, and inflation is a big issue. Okay, the follow-on question is, well, how do you address it? What are the things that a member or a candidate are going, or say they're going to do to actually address inflation? How do you view it? If it's all budget cutting, well, a program like SNAP will increase in an inflationary situation because the cost of food that's used to calculate those benefits is going to go up to some degree. And so I think I think there are those kind of guidance pieces that you get out of your 30-second commercial. Like if this is a candidate looking at some of the partisan, budget pieces, then you can imagine that they're going to have a challenge with the farm bill. But I think we're also realistic about, I think, where our politics is at this point in time, and we're not overly focused on specific programs and policies. I mean, it's kind of a different conversation, and I think that's tough. That's particularly for somebody who probably spends more time than is mentally healthy in the weeds of policies.
Well, and I mean, I like to think of public media that we get into policy. I mean, market to market. That's what we've tried to hang a hat on is the policy discussion and not the politics of. But you can't say they're not tied together because they are.
They are very much tied together, and it makes for good conversations. I teach students of this, and I talk about part of politics is to disagree, and it's fine to disagree. It's where we kind of lose focus, and the point of the exercise becomes just attacking and just sort of those less meaningful discussions, maybe, for lack of a better way to describe them. So I agree with you. I think the policies play into it. I think it's tough to get into those details in a campaign.
I just wish on your background, Jonathan, that you had more campaign experience so I could ask you the question of, well, but I thought on campaigns we're supposed to divide because we're supposed to highlight what our differences are, not how similar we are. And that's the way, because people, I mean, I get told this, I hear this in discussions at family gatherings that, well, those election people, meaning operatives or whatever title you want to use, they're only making it different so they can put a wedge between you and them to differentiate their candidate. Am I that wrong?
No, I mean, you are correct in the sense that it's a winner, like it's a winner take all system.
It's a sport.
And so you gotta pick amongst two alternatives, or pick between two alternatives. And so that is true. Again, I'm a realist. I know that nobody's going to get into these discussions the way I would like. But there is, I think what we see with this polarization and with the way it transcends or goes beyond just a campaign, season, and then really gets into how governing is undertaken, then it gets a little tough, because, and again, I recognize that maybe my views aren't the same as everybody, but I think where we lose this art of compromise and negotiation is when we start to lose our ability to govern. And the idea that there's only one way to do this, or there has to be my way or the highway, and you see some of these candidates who basically build their platforms on, I will never compromise, I will never back down. And it's like, well, you're one in 332 million people. Like, I have not seen any one person yet that has all the answers. And so you're going to have to, get into the debate. And if you're not, then you kind of wonder, why are you running for office if you don't want to work with the other 534 members of the body that you're campaigning for?
When did changing your mind because you learned more about an issue become a bad thing? It's because you can be labeled as a flip-flopper.
That's a struggle.
Yeah.
We would hope people would learn it on the job and adjust based on what they learn. Yes.
We spent a whole lot of time talking about basically the red or blue discussions that might impact a farm bill specifically. Are there specific races across the country, ballot issues, ballot initiatives that are of interest? I mean, we always like to put together a list of things of, oh, well, see, in Texas, they're electing an ag commissioner. In Iowa, it's a secretary of ag. And in California, always look at their ballot initiatives. Are there any across the country that have caught your eye this cycle?
Well, I'll have to admit, I don't follow the ballot initiatives very closely. We see some of these, like California is a great example because there's been a Supreme Court, or there is a Supreme Court case on the confinement crates for hogs, and so some of these ballot initiatives can really find their way from outside the state and open up a whole series of discussions. But I'm not tracking any one initiative or anything too closely. I think a lot of, we're going to see some significant turnover, particularly in the House Ag Committee, and so those will be it'll be interesting to see who from Illinois' perspective in particular, we're losing some pretty big, somebody like Sherry Bustos.
Sherry Bustos, I was going to say, she was just about ready to be chair of that committee if she would have stuck around.
She's a great representative and is in the district my in-laws live in, and so I hear a lot about her. And so it's, there's a lot of institutional knowledge. There's a lot of really good political kind of understanding about negotiating through these things and working through these issues. So I kind of watch those sort of races and get a sense of, okay, what might this committee look like? And in the House in particular, leadership's such a big deal because it's such a big driver. Senators can kind of work their own way a bit more in the process, whereas setting up the leadership and how that is going to direct the way they think about it is probably as important to a farm bill discussion as anything. And so that's more of what I'm trying to keep track of. There's a lot of races out there. It's difficult to keep track of them all. And we have this odd fixation on polling, and we both expect it to give us the answers, and we doubt everything it says. So you sort of get lost in the maelstrom of it all.
What's the old term? Question but verify?
Yes. Yeah. Or accept but verify. Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
You mentioned your students. I should allow you to say what it is that you do teach there at the University of Illinois.
Sure. In the fall, I teach a class on the history and development of farm bills, and I try to use that as a way to talk about Congress and how Congress has worked and it's designed to work and the theories about it. And then I get them, I get them lost in the history of farm bills and how did we get to this point and where did this policy come from? And so it's quite a bit of fun, I think. Most of them stay awake most of the time, I think. So at least we get to that. But, we try to do things like simulate committee markups and get a chance to just come up with amendments and vote on them and things like that. So that's what I'm teaching here in the fall. And then in the spring, I teach a class on agricultural law, which I always joke is like the two halves of my brain, or the two cells I have left in my brain, the policy side and the law side. And I try to stay up on both of them.
Well, but they do tie together because, again, who's elected can help determine what is legal, what becomes a law that then has to stand up in challenges. I mean, I go back to Iowa. We've put ag-gag through four times. Again, California has put through various things that follow. Iowa has them. Illinois has them. So there is ag law. Is there an ag law issue that maybe is up for, I guess, verification, validation at the polling place this year?
An ag law issue, I think a lot of it gets picked up in other issues. So climate change is a great example. Where a member or where a candidate is on climate change is probably going to determine a lot of how they think about property rights and environmental regulation and waters of the U.S. type questions and things like that really come into play. One of the ones that I sort of on my to-do list to dig into and think about for class is around antitrust and competition issues, because we've seen this incredible, and I don't necessarily mean that in a positive way, but this sort of unbelievable at times consolidation in the industry, whether it's the input side, the food side, or even at the farm level. The number of farmers, dwindling, and its consolidated size in the industry. So I've been thinking about for a couple of semesters now, like, okay, how do you even begin tackling that issue? But it's a great example. Like, where do candidates, how many candidates are talking about antitrust law? I mean, that seems like ancient topics, but it's pretty important on the ground. It's really important to a farmer who's maybe looking at one or two options for seed and for inputs. And so it's on my list. I want to delve into that more. And then I think, to your point, it's like sort of how do you link that with governing philosophies and an idea of competition, I think, is really fascinating to talk about, because, we get sometimes lost in thinking about it. Competition requires rules. It requires, nobody wants to watch a football game that doesn't have referees on the field and kind of keep the wheels on the competition. And so we have to think about the same thing in our marketplace, in our corporate and legal settings, and how we design those rules, how we enforce those rules. I'm very fascinated by it. I just haven't figured out how to quite turn that into a set of class material that students might be interested in. But those, I think, are going to be big questions going forward, because of the consolidation, because of how that consolidation is playing out. Everything from jobs and local opportunities all the way up to, the water quality issues and climate change. One of the things that we talk about around climate change is what could these things, how could these impact, if you only have a few players out there, how are they going to treat it, and who's going to benefit, and how does that, translate back into healthy competition for these outcomes. So we'll see. Maybe we talk in the spring. I can tell you if I figured out what I want to do with class next year.
Well, I look at let the free market, or the market itself, works itself out, or it decides some of these issues. And I'll just leave you with this, Jonathan, that look at packer margins, and how much competition have we talked about? There's no competition in the place with only three big packers. Packer margins in 6 months to 8 months have all but evaporated and gone neutral versus all in favor. And this is while there's been several policies discussed and laws trying to work out a new law that can help. You can't even get members of the Republican Senate to agree upon what they think is best for the cattle industry, let alone a Democrat involved in that discussion. So in that sense, you could say, well, you don't need a law. The market's worked itself out.
Maybe. I think any competition is going to require good rules and enforcement of those rules to make sure that, and maybe I go crossways with my economist colleagues on this a little bit. I think the market is itself, it's not an entity that's outside of it. I mean, we also want to control that market because it is part of, our society and our system of government and everything else. And so, free market, yes, to an extent. We're also competing on a world stage with many markets that aren't free. And so we have to think about that competition, and, how consumer demand makes its way back through that market. To your point on packers, I mean, that is one of those just incredibly tough issues that there are not simple solutions, and it can cross party lines, but it can really complicate a lot of the politics around these issues. And sorry for the chimes in the background.
That means it's the end of the interview, is what you're saying.
I guess we're getting close to that.
We are getting there.
I'm saved by the bell there. I'm talking too much about packer margins.
We'll save that for another episode. How about that?
Well, I have my homework to do on that topic. There's no doubt about it.
Well, we all do. And it is. And I think what you're saying is, if it was easy, I think we would have had something by now. It is incredibly hard to work through. It is. There's no doubt.
It is without a doubt. Yeah. And it is, even we think about oil and oil markets and competition, and we watch something like OPEC Plus, jump in at its own, whim to change those sort of things. And that works its way through the whole system. Packers as well. The tight margins one day are look like profit taking the next, and thinking through not just how that competition works for the farmer, for the consumer, but for the industry itself. Is it healthy to have only a few big players, working through that? Well, and if it's not, how do you go about changing without causing even greater disruptions or problems?
Favoring
The law of
one thing
unintended
over another.
consequences.
Yeah. All right, Jonathan, I better let you get back to class. I appreciate the time.
Absolutely. It's great to talk to you.
Thank you so much. Jonathan Coppess, University of Illinois. Thank you. New episodes of the MTOM come out each and every Tuesday. Subscribe via YouTube if you want to see the video, or audio if you just want to hear it and take us along. We always appreciate however you consume this content. If you have feedback for us, market-to-market at iowapbs.org. And we haven't asked for comments in a while, so if you have something you want us to know, you can leave those in the comments there, and we'll get back to you. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.